Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. I know you're all looking forward to that final session for the day by veterans who need no introduction. Let me introduce Mr. Karan Bhagat, the founder, managing director, and chief executive officer of IIFL Wealth and Asset Management. Now, Mr. Bhagat has more than 2 decades of experience in the financial services industry. He featured in Fortune India's 40 under 40 list in 2016 and 2017 and the Economic Times 40 under 40 list in 2017. He has received the URS Asia One Global Indian of the Year Award in 2018. A very warm welcome to you, Mr. Bhagat. Let me also now introduce Mrs. Radhika Gupta, who's going to be steering this conversation. She's the MD and CEO of Edelweiss Asset Management Limited, a graduate from the Management and Technology program at the University of Pennsylvania, United States, with joint degrees in economics from the Wharton School and computer science engineering from the Moore School. She is the founding president of the University of Pennsylvania Alumni Club, a member of the Global Leadership Council of the Management and Technology program, and a board member of the Association of Mutual Funds in India, a living inspiration and role model for me and all the women in our midst. Ma'am, such a pleasure to have you on board. And now I'm going to hand over the proceedings to you, Mrs. Radhika Gupta, ladies and gentlemen. Let's welcome both Mr. Karan Bhagat and Mrs. Radhika Gupta. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you, Aishwarya, and thank you, Kamal, and the entire PMS AIF World team. I am delighted to do this session with you, Karan. We've interacted many times, and I think my history of knowing Karan starts from, I think, a little after IIFL Wealth started in 2009, and I had just moved back to start Forefront Capital. Obviously, a decade has gone by. I rarely, because Karan has played the role of head of wealth and I have been an asset manager, I've always found myself answering questions. So it's going to be a fun opportunity to ask questions. So I wouldn't have given this up for anything. And because I'm a mutual fund CEO, I should start with a disclaimer. Karan, if I say anything I'm not supposed to, you'll forgive me after the next 30 minutes.
Thank you, Radhika. Thank you, Aishwarya. Thank you, Kamal, and the entire team. I look forward to the session. Always a pleasure to be here.
Terrific. So, Karan, I think the theme of the PMS and AIF World event, and we love to crystal gaze, I guess, in our industry, was crystal gazing forward to the next decade. But I thought before we talk about sort of the next decade, it would be very interesting to talk about the decade that has passed. And, you know, you've really built the wealth and asset business for IIFL in that decade. So how do you feel that the wealth business has evolved in that decade? What changes have you seen in the business? If you can just walk us through the last decade.
It's a great question, Radhika. If I just go back at the time I started my career in the year 2001, I think honestly, wealth management business for us was largely selling portfolio management schemes. So it was just about selling your own PMS schemes, which was pretty much, I think, between 2002 to 2006-07. Obviously, 2007 kind of got its own vagaries, and pretty much the volatility of 2008 had us answer a lot of different kind of questions to clients. Also, a couple of large clients, especially on the tech side, ended up getting a large amount of capital because of monetizing some assets. And they really started questioning and debating about this entire concept of family offices, which had emerged across the Western region. So I first remember really going back in 2005, 2006, to work with McKinsey and BCG on a project to look at family offices for large clients. And it's really then, I think, somewhere around the 2006-07, we kind of moved away from thinking about a pure PMS play to potentially asset allocation. I don't think so. We were as matured in 2007-08 to start looking at only advisory, but we definitely started looking at asset allocation in a very pragmatic way in 2007-2008. I think 2009 to 12 in some ways was about ensuring that building a process, asset allocation, getting the right investment portfolio statement in place for the client. And somewhere 2012-13, the kind of murmurs around the regulatory overhang on removal of upfront commission started. And 2014 onwards, we were kind of forced to, in some good ways, look at beyond transaction churning AUM and start focusing more on trail assets. Obviously, the regulator did it in parts. First, the reduction to 1% cap, and then obviously a full trail kind of mechanism. But I think the last 4 or 5 years in that sense has been, for us, has been largely focused on trying to see how we can move our business from a upfront commission model to a trail model. And I think it's been a tough, it's a tough journey because you need to kind of metamorphosize your entire business. For all wealth managers, the fixed cost continues to be there. But I think we took a tough decision 2.5, 3 years back to kind of change that model. And I think now it's fair to say that the business is largely open architecture. And more often than not, all our large clients are essentially coming on a fee-driven platform as opposed to a distribution platform. Historically, a lot of our clients continue to be on the distribution mindset. But I think going forward, the only way to really build out the business in a large way will be either to do it through the non-discretionary or discretionary multi-asset class platform, or potentially also look at kind of a pure advisory kind of framework. So I think different blocks. Now, from a regulatory perspective, I should just kind of compare ourselves to the developed world, both UK and US. I think we've reached a stage where we are fairly at par with most of these regulations. So it's unlikely that we'll see crazy amount of regulatory changes from here on. At some point, the upfront commissions in AIF will go away. I think it's at some point over the next 6 to 24 months it will happen. But outside of that, I really don't see too many regulatory changes. And in some senses, it gives us the ability to plan and now build a sustainable business model going forward.
I think that's very helpful, and I will definitely come and talk to you about fees and IFL1 and some of that experience a little later in the conversation. But now, after this decade, sort of sitting in 2020, and look, everybody's talked about changes in 2020, technology, more investment options emerging for clients. Clients have just experienced more, good or bad. And everybody keeps talking about change. I don't think everything needs to change. So in your view, what needs to stay the same going into the decade that's coming? And what do you need to change to remain relevant?
So I think one thing which doesn't need to change, and I think is the cornerstone of our business, honestly, I would rather say 3 things, right? So, and it can sound mundane, but it has to be said. I think the intent to do right by the client has to remain constant, right? It doesn't necessarily, and sometimes it gets confused with being right all the time. That's not possible. But the intention to be right all the time ensures a probability or a success ratio of at least 90-95%, and that's what is extremely critical. And I think that doesn't change pre-2020, post-2020. Second is, I think as a relationship manager, especially on the wealth management side, I think there is no escape or no substitute for sincerity, effort, and commitment, because it's a laborious job. It's not only about some super ideas or a Superman kind of approach. You have to be there with the client. You have to be there with him through his toughest times. So I think sincerity, effort, and commitment, again, are irreplaceable virtues. And third, irrespective of the advisory piece coming in, I think innovation is constant. So I think that was there for the last 10, 12 years. We still have to sit as a team constantly, whether it's monthly, quarterly, yearly, 6 monthly, and constantly keep innovating, because really, in that sense, innovation will kind of allow us to keep expanding in a big way. So 3 things which I think are going to be absolutely constant are client centricity, innovation, as well as the ability to be there available with the clients 24 hours. What's going to change? I think on the wealth management side, especially on the segment we are in, which is the ultra high net worth individual side, I think what may not change is the quick adoption of these clients into a fintech advisory platform. But what we will need, however, is a huge change in the digital interface. Okay? So clients will get used to a much better platform. They will get used to much faster response times. They will get used to a much better analytics platform coming from the relationship managers and the team. So while the decision-making might not become as digital as we think it is, I think firms which are not able to adopt to the right CRM practices all the way to the right platform and analytics will have to kind of face a fairly critical assessment from the client on the platform. So that's something which we all need to invest in. I think it's fair to say, including us, we've not been at the forefront of investment on the digital side. And that's something which is extremely important for us to kind of build out. The second thing I think which will change is the fact that, business models will have to be substantially more sustainable. And when I say sustainable, I think we will discover an equal kind of balance between all stakeholders. And when I say stakeholders, I include Radhika, your business on the manufacturing side, the wealth management side. Within wealth management, obviously, the firm, the relationship manager, as well as the client, right? All three are equal stakeholders in that sense. And, there will be some order which will prevail in terms of the right balance of fees, commission, and service between all of these three. And I think all three will mature in some way. The firm will mature and will learn to kind of build a slightly different business model. The client will mature and learn to pay a little bit of a fee. And the relationship manager also has to mature and kind of understand that it's a very delicate balance between long-term AUM and transactions for him to kind of sustainably grow and build for himself the right compensation structure. So I think there will be that right, if I can, for the lack of a better word, the right ecological balance which will emerge on the wealth management side. And second, I think a lot of investment on the digital framework will be required.
I think you've just made a lot of manufacturers, including me on this call, smile with that last statement on the ecosystem. So thank you. That's a lot of optimism for us. But let me shift the gears to actually managers, because you're in a position where you see a lot of managers, and there are a lot of managers, asset managers listening in on this call. I want to understand a little bit about what you as wealth advisors and manager and clients are looking for from managers. I think there was a time when managers were a brand. So you were either a Franklin or an HDFC or whatever, a JP Morgan, etc., etc. Is it still about the brand? Is it about the individual? Are clients a lot more deep in terms of their understanding of investment process? So what do clients understand, and what are you looking for from your managers now?
So I think 2-3 points there. I think, honestly, I think if I'll divide the world into two, one is really the mutual fund space, and second is on the manufacturing side, and second is the portfolio management and the AIF space. I'll club portfolio management and AIF together. So there, I think to a certain extent on the former, which is the mutual fund space, I think firms like us will be relatively liberal. I'm saying relatively liberal on the brand and the platform. I think there the focus really will be will come with the assumption that the regulatory framework is extremely tight. We are doing what we're supposed to do. Little chances of anything going wrong, and spend a lot of time in diligencing the product and the idea and the scheme, rather than necessarily kind of over investing on the brand itself. On the PMS and the AIF side, I think unfortunately or fortunately, I think the risk-reward ratio to take something new to the client is not really in the favor of a wealth manager quickly. Okay, if it goes well, it's not as if it's one part of the client's experience, and it's not as if he's going to really reward you for it. But if it goes badly, you have a lot of brickbat to face for it. So on the PMS side and AIF, over a period of the last decade or so, we've become a little conservative. Obviously, if it's our own internal asset management products which we are controlling, we end up doing a little bit of exotic stuff. But on the other side, on the outside, we typically want to see a 18 to 24 month or at least a 12 to 18 month track record before we kind of get out stuff. So I think overall, it's fair to say it's a combination of brand and track record. But I think track record and brand both, especially track record on the second one, we need for a longer period of time. Before we kind of onboard platform. Now we also kind of started distinguishing between reverse distribution and advisory. So a lot of platforms quickly come onto our, a lot of product manufacturers will come onto our platform on a distribution or a reverse distribution side. But on the advisory side, we wait for the 18 to 24 month kind of time period to get over. In terms of what clients want, I think honestly, clients don't like too much change. They want consistency. They want a little bit of predictability. I think it's fair to say a part of your AUM, 20 to 30%, can be opportunistic and trend driven. It can kind of scale up quickly. But for it really to last its time period of 5 to 10 years, you'll have to have a lot of consistency in performance. I think clients are not aiming for the highest return. They are aiming for an optimal return. And I think that's a lesson we've learned multiple times over the last 20 years. I think we are not in the business of giving the client the highest return. We are in the business of giving the optimal return. And that's something which we keep reminding ourselves. And we try and ensure that we get into products which will not end up being too volatile in terms of performance.
So I just want to take off on that. And I know you mentioned new managers, and I've known from IIFL, Karan, that you have a history, or you have had a history of sort of being innovative and backing new managers. I remember our history goes back to the very early days of Forefront Capital. Obviously, there is more conservatism that has come in, but for the new and boutique managers that are listening on the call, what do they really need to do? What are the one or two things that they really need to do to become part of a platform like yours?
So I think yeah. I think while we are conservative, we are very, very encouraging to new managers, right? So I think there is practically no new manager where we are not saying that we will invest some part of our money to begin with and understand the performance for the first 12 to 18 months. If you would remember, even in the case of Forefront, I think we put in, I don't remember, but 5 to 6 crores to start off the platform. And, we are very open to that. We love new ideas. It's just that we become a little more conservative in taking it out to clients. We want to understand it better, but we love to work with new managers. We've had some great experiences. If I just go back over the last 3 to 4 years, classic examples in AIF and PMS for us would have been successful examples would be Purnartha and Vaito, both of whom we kind of took off first into the market. They've obviously kind of scaled up. They've also done well in terms of performance. But having said that, every new manager, more often than not, especially on the outside the listed space, we are very happy to participate. Sometimes we end up putting our own capital, understanding the manager better for the next 12 to 18 months before we kind of take him to our clients. But we are very, very keen to work with new managers. And on the unlisted side, we pretty much sitting as LPs for most managers in the country. We would be having a fairly large percentage of practically all the top 10 VC funds where we would have participated in some way or the other. So very open to new managers. I think there's no limit to ideas in the country. We're very entrepreneurial, and we understand that because all of us have come with the same background. But at the same point of time, there's a bit of a silver line or a thin balance between taking each product to the client before kind of understanding it deeply.
So I want to move to the topic of fees, and I think to the new managers, I think this is at least a message that at least start having a conversation, because one of the challenges as new managers is you don't even go out and have the conversation with someone like Karan. And so I think this is a good motivation to sort of go out and have that conversation. I want to come to the topic of fees, which you alluded to, Karan. There is a lot that is happening on the fee front. Obviously, there are low-cost products coming out, especially on the fixed income side. There are passive products coming out. There are changes in advisory models, as you talked about. Two questions. I think the first question I have for you is, how much do clients care about your fees? How much do they care about fees in your segment, and what will they pay fees for?
So clients, I think, let me put it this way. I think the right sentence for it is clients are sensitive to fees. Okay? So I think it's fair to say that they are sensitive to fees. They like to know what they are paying. And secondly, they also want to be fairly sure that fee is not the reason why they showed up. Okay? I think those two things would come first. And third would be how much fee they are paying. Okay? So I think the first two aspects are very, very important. And that's really where most of the discussions with our clients fail, as opposed to the third one. And then there are certain set of clients, which would be less than, I would believe, 10 to 15 to 20%, which would only care about fees, right? But they are that way only. And then you end up dealing with them on a distribution basis as opposed to dealing with them on a advisory basis, which is fine. So, you can't change every client, but I think 75 to 80% of the clients are of the other nature, where they're sensitive to fees. They know what they are paying, and they like to at least get the feeling that they're getting a good deal, right? Nobody likes not a good deal. So I think those three things are fairly clear. Let's not forget, India is a first generational market, more or less, where most of the monies got created in the mid-80s to today. So therefore, we will be very, we will be sensitive to fees. So it's not something which we can run away from. But broadly, I think what clients are willing to pay, in my experience, is somewhere between the 35 to 60 basis points. What they want to pay for is asset allocation. They want to pay for instrument selection. Will they pay for the simplest debt product, 35, 60 basis points? The answer is no. I think that's a space which will get kind of constantly disrupted. But will they pay for advice as to when in debt, when in equity, which product in debt? I think the answer is yes. And along with that, there's a huge amount of consolidation, investment discipline, all of that which comes in. So I think somewhere it will settle down between the 35 to 60 basis points of AUM, and this will get broken once the AUM moves beyond 150 to 100 crores. I think then it'll kind of move towards a capped out fee model where you'll get the 35 to 60 basis points, but at some level it will kind of get capped out. Transaction fee, I think, will become lower and lower, whether it's brokerage or it's bonds. I think transaction fee will become very difficult to kind of justify unless and until you're doing the rest of the advisory for the client, right? So in that sense, he will more or less use your transaction services as a free captive service as long as he's paying you the fee on the asset. So overall, I think if with the right scale and the platform and multiple avenues of the NBFC and everything coming together, I think 35 to 60, 65 basis points on different profiles is what works. From a manager perspective today, as a wealth manager for our distribution clients and for our direct clients, we are more or less today at 50-55% kind of sharing with practically most of our managers, and that's something which we are comfortable with. And obviously, we understand the smaller the manager, the lesser our share, because otherwise it really doesn't make it productive enough for him to kind of be in business. And obviously now with the direct plan coming in, even in PMSs and potentially also in AIFs, the ability to come in through the advisory bucket has kind of increased substantially.
So since you talked about PMS and AIF, let's talk a little bit about alternative products, because that is sort of the fulcrum of this. Now, there has been growth in alternative investing. Everyone's sort of bullish about it, and it is a mixed experience. Some of the products and some of the managers are very, very good, and there's good stuff happening there. Some of it, clients will say, is a little overkill. How do you find the right balance between when to give an alternative product and what is really too much? So what is too much innovation and what is the right kind of innovation on this platform?
I think, Radhika, our own experience has been positive, to be honest, on an average, right? So I think if I was to look at the last 6-7 years on an average, I think it's worked out well. But like you're rightly saying, there are some pluses and some minuses. I think two minuses I can think of, and there are a whole host of pluses also. I think, generally speaking, the ability or the lack of, or rather the feature of having a certain locked-in date for listed equity makes AIFs a little less attractive, especially on the locked-in category 3 side, which has got an aspect of taxation to it. Because sometimes if you get the timing wrong, generally speaking, your experience becomes a little bit adverse as compared to a mutual fund or a PMS where you kind of stick it in and necessarily don't exit at the worst point of time. In the AIF, more often than not, when the scheme comes to an end and it's not doing well, the ability to kind of extend it becomes very, very difficult. And secondly, I think generally speaking, sometimes the themes are such where they kind of orient fund managers to be a little more mid-capish or a little bit more sectoral focused in nature, or sometimes even more thematic in nature. And, sometimes that doesn't play off, right? It's much better being, especially in the last 3-4 years, you're just much better off in a diversified multi-cap or a large cap scheme rather than having played any theme in that sense at all. Obviously, last 6-8 months has seen a bit of a pickup. So I think outside these two, where, you kind of by default or design get into some kind of innovation, sometimes on the listed equity piece, which is not necessary. And second, you have a predefined locked-in date. These two, I would put the negatives, but on the positives, there are many, right? So the ability to do things like, like what you've also done, what we've done, the pre-IPO fund, a lot of the private equity stuff, the ability to kind of consolidate a huge amount of concentrated, good unlisted positions, have the power to hold on for 5 to 6, 7 years. Those are big, big positives. And, structured credit is a big, big space. Very, very interesting. Obviously, has many positives because it doesn't have the same problems like mutual funds, where effectively you've got a big asset liability mismatch in case you're doing a structured lending, right? So that space for mutual funds obviously is not possible. And therefore, in that sense, many positives. Overall, I think it's fair to say 8 or 9 out of 10 have worked out well. The places where it's not worked out well, I think it's either because we had a predefined time period, or because it ended up being a little more thematic without the need for it to be thematic.
I want to just touch on one area that's at least we're seeing is getting more interest. And Karan, I've heard you talk about it, which is the whole space of investing abroad and people talking about investing abroad. And at least we feel that it's also richening beyond the US. So, you'll have themes like China or Asia, etc., sort of coming up. How do you see that evolving, and how are you building your capability as an advisor also? Because investing abroad, I think, pushes up the level of knowledge. The RM, the platform also have to deliver.
I think it's a great point, Radhika. I think that's something which is absolutely critical. I don't think so any of us can ignore it. It won't be limited. So you'll have to there are three dimensions to investing abroad, right? So one is the entire dimension of LRS. It's a little complicated dimension because when it comes to LRS, the client really has 2 or 3 objectives. It doesn't have only one objective. The first objective is obviously investing and finding the right set of instruments. It's very important for an advisor like ours to be able to synergize with the right platform. So effectively, whether we become an external asset manager to one of the global private banks, or we get into some kind of tie-up with them, where we are able to access that platform, will become more and more important. Secondly, the client's also looking for an ability to create a corpus outside. So he ideally wants a bank account outside also. So whatever tie-up we do can't be just limited to an Interactive Brokers or a Saxo or something like that, where the client just transfers the money and trades some stocks there. He's eventually looking at creating a corpus outside also. So in a sense, the LRS investments piece obviously requires us to tap with a global platform. Second, it needs an access to a bank account. And third, it has an additional problem of accessing a global good private bank platform with the ability to start off only with 200, 250 US, right? Because most of these large banks would typically not start off with less than a couple of million. So these 3 problems need to be solved. Obviously, we are in late stages of discussions with a lot of global private banks globally to try and get our clients access to this platform. And obviously also have the ability to open up a bank account and yet work within the regulatory purviews of what is possible and what is not possible in the country. On the second side, obviously, is this entire feeder fund story, right, which does not have this limit of 250 US, and I think that's going to pick up in a big way. I think Indians, generally speaking, are fairly aware of the fact that all global international markets have done fairly well across different time periods. I think there is a lot of interest in China, Greater China, rest of Asia, a little bit less interest in Europe, but potentially a lot of interest in the US. So I think that's a space which is set to grow. I think it's fair to say over the last 3 to 4 months at least, it's become an active part of every client's discussion on new allocation. And typically, I think clients are now comfortable to say 3 to 5% of my allocation can go into, let's say, US and China, depending on whether they use the feeder or the LRS. But I think 3 to 5% is a comfort factor. And the new other asset class, which is emerging to be the 2 to 5% kind of range, is essentially your entire REITs platform, right? So effectively, these two new, if I can call it for the lack of a better word, asset classes have kind of emerged over the last 6 to 9 months.
Excellent. And I think we run a China fund and we've run it for 7 years, but I've never answered any questions about a fund as much as I have about China in the last year. So I'm wondering what has changed, but clearly something has. So before I move to the last segment, which is my rapid fire, I'll ask you a closing question and move to the rapid fire. We'll wrap up by 2:35. As you look at the next decade in all the change, what makes you excited about the business?
So I think the biggest excitement for me in the business is, I think I was just telling somebody, in fact, 3 immediate thoughts which come to my mind is, personally, I've never had as much clarity on the business model and the ability to kind of scale up the business in the right format, the way I have now. And, we are obviously continuously learning every year. And every year, I think I'm going to be clearer and wiser next year. But this time around, I feel much more surer about myself than I ever felt over the last 5 to 10 years. On both aspects, on what to do and what not to do. and both are equally important. It's not only the former which is important, the latter is equally important. So that gives me a lot of confidence. Second, obviously, all of us end up working in an ecosystem. We can be sharpshooters, we can be God's gift to mankind, but at the end of the day, we have to work within the environment, and the environment has to do well. And that's really what is a very optimistic time right now, because the amount of new financial assets being created by clients is equal to never before. So we are going to be lucky enough to operate in an environment where the size of the pie is going to grow larger and larger. And obviously different players will end up with different amounts of market share. But I think it's very, very important for the size of the market to grow in a very pragmatic way. And that gives me a lot of excitement. And third, I think, in a sense, I think animal spirits are back is a word which we like to use. But in some ways, I think, the government's also given a big indication in terms of saying that, we are happy to indulge in infrastructure spending, a lot of public spending, maybe comfortable with a little bit of increase in fiscal deficit. So I think overall, the overall environment, our platform, and our own understanding of the business, all these three things, coming together is what is really of a lot of excitement for me.
Excellent. So since your name is Karan and it's also an afternoon, we have to finish this with a rapid fire. My name starts with R, so I guess I can call it rum with Radhika, Karan, okay, even though there's no rum here, and I'm not drinking. And I promise I'll send you some kind of nice hamper at the end of this, maybe with mutual fund units. So some fun questions. They have to be rapid and they'll have to have fire. So Vidya Balan said that films are about entertainment, entertainment, entertainment. What is wealth management about?
I think commitment to the client.
Okay, so it's commitment, commitment, commitment.
Yeah.
Okay. Over the next 10 years, rank in order of growth, which of the three asset classes do you think will grow the fastest? Active mutual funds, passive mutual funds, and alternative assets.
I think passive followed by alternate followed by active.
Fabulous.
Obviously in percentage terms. Yeah.
Yeah, percentage terms, not absolute terms. So 3 Bs that have been in the news lately, your few word comment on these 3 Bs, the budget.
No, I think positive. You want me to think? Yeah.
2-3 words.
Positive. I think expansionary for the economy, and I think the Provident Fund obviously is a big cumulative hit for all of us, because it effectively increases the tax by 2.5% on a cumulative amount for many years to come. So the NPV of that amount is not calculatable, and I'm staying away from calculating it.
Okay, the second B, Bitcoin and the fuss around crypto.
I don't understand it, honestly. So I'm not a big believer in Bitcoin. But what I'm told is a lot of people who are hedging the equity markets are now hedging instead of using gold, using Bitcoin. But I'm not a big believer yet, because the war of digital currencies will be played by the governments also soon. So there's too much to come there. And
finally, Biden administration for India.
I think positive. I think US-India, generally speaking, relations have been good. I don't think so. Where we are today, the US can also kind of afford to ignore us fully. I think a little bit of pluses and minuses, but generally speaking, positive, because a lot of relaxations on people, especially engineers and so on and so forth, going back to the US. So overall, a much more liberal environment. I think we'll mutually benefit.
All right. One financial product that's come out in India in the last 2-3 years that you really liked.
Radhika, since you're asking it, I have to say the Edelweiss Debt ETF.
Oh, God, you made my day. Thank you. All right.
We have a lot of money in it, so.
Thank you. That's one we are very proud of. Okay, so you're in the business of advice. So 2-3 words of advice to the following people, fund managers.
No, so mutual fund managers, consistency, nothing else.
Mutual fund CEOs, I'm one of them.
I don't think so. I'm smart enough to answer that. But I think my personal view is we have to innovate.
Okay, good one. And finally, aspiring wealth managers.
No substitute to hard work and effort. Yeah. So I think honestly, wealth management is more about hard work and effort rather than about science and product knowledge, and all of that comes secondary.
I'm glad you said that. Okay, last two questions. If I gave you 10 crores, how would you invest it?
No, so personally, I would be obviously a little overweighted equities over the longer term. So I would have around about 60-70% equity and 30% in opportunistic debt. So I don't end up doing too much safe debt, but I like taking a little bit of credit risk exposure, what I understand. So 20-30% credit risk debt, not more than 15-20% private equity. I don't like too much of my money illiquid, and 50% in listed equity.
Okay, and your final question for the day. If I made you finance minister for the day, what would you do?
No, so I think if I was finance minister, I would have a fairly different tax system in place. I think we're much more focused on. I think we're fairly overtaxed in that sense, but I think corporate tax is great at 25%. I think I would potentially kind of reduce the direct tax for individuals, and potentially, if needed, increase the indirect tax a bit to keep the fiscal deficit constant.
You'll have a lot of votes to become finance minister. And Karan, thank you so much for being a sport with all my questions. It was fab talking to you, and wish you guys a rocking decade.
Thank you, Radhika. Thanks a lot. Thank you.
Thank you very much to both of you, Mrs. Gupta, and thank you, Mr. Bhagat. That was indeed a wonderful session, and you are truly the power duo. We got a lot of insights on disruptive trends and future of wealth management industry over the next decade. So thank you so much once again. Now, ladies and gentlemen, thank you. After that session that, ended on a spirited high note, just what we needed to usher in the most awaited part of the event. Ladies and gentlemen, it's time for accolades and jubilation, which means we are going to be starting with the finale of this 2 days event, which is the award ceremony. But the award ceremony will come in after about 5 to 7 minutes of prep. So I would request all of you to please wait for us with bated breath and don't go away anywhere. 5 to 7 minutes is all we need to bring our panelists on board, and then we will start the award ceremony. Thank you very much. Stay with me on this break. Thank you.